I don't care who you think you are. That fire is a violation, and I'm having you arrested for endangering this entire community." Her voice, a shrill instrument of pure indignation, cut through the crisp evening air, sharp enough to slice the peaceful crackle of my bonfire down to a nervous hiss. She stood on the edge of my property line, a formidable silhouette against the deepening twilight, her plus-size frame clad in a pastel pink tracksuit that seemed to vibrate with self-importance. One hand was planted firmly on a hip wide enough to establish its own zip code, while the other held her smartphone aloft, its red recording light a malevolent, unblinking eye. This was Karen, the newly crowned queen of the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association, and I was her first dragon to slay. The fire, a modest, controlled burn in a steel ring pit well over 100 feet from any structure, was merely the pretext. The real issue was my existence, a stubborn 10-acre island of independence in the middle of her meticulously curated suburban sea. She had already declared my property a blight, an affront to the beige-tone conformity she worshipped, and this bonfire was my declaration of war. I watched her thumb stab at her phone screen, her voice dripping with manufactured panic as she spoke to the 911 dispatcher. "Yes, a raging inferno. At 1240 Ridge Road. The flames are 50 feet high. He's a maniac." I glanced at the flames, which were politely licking at a seasoned oak log, barely reaching my chest. My wife, Sarah, stepped closer to me, her hand finding mine, her knuckles white. My son, Leo, just 16, looked from Karen to me, his expression a mixture of teenage embarrassment and burgeoning anger. I gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "It's all right," I murmured, my voice low and steady. "Let her play her part. The third act is always the best. If you've ever had your peace shattered by a power-tripping HOA president who thinks a three-ring binder of bylaws makes them a feudal lord, then hit that subscribe button right now and tell me your own nightmare story in the comments below. You are not going to believe where this road goes, because what Karen didn't know as she summoned the law down upon my head was that in this county, when it came to fire, I was the law. My name is Mark Rivera. For 24 years, I was a colonel in the United States Army Corps of Engineers. I managed logistics in deserts, built bridges under fire, and learned that the most effective way to deal with an adversary is to let them trip over their own arrogance. When I retired, I didn't want a golf course community or a condo with a view. I wanted peace. I wanted the land my grandfather had farmed, a 10-acre plot on a ridge overlooking the valley, with an old stone house he built with his own two hands. I bought it back from the family who'd owned it after him, and for a decade, Sarah and I had our peace. We had our gardens, our workshop, and the kind of quiet that sinks right into your bones. Then came the developer. He bought the 300 acres of farmland surrounding my property and threw up Oakwood Estates, a sprawling labyrinth of identical houses with identical lawns and identical rules. My property was never sold, never annexed, never part of the deal. My deed, recorded and filed with the county decades before Oakwood Estates was even a gleam in a developer's eye, was ironclad. I was a sovereign entity, a little slice of history the modern world had been forced to build around. For the first few years, it was fine. The HOA was a distant, toothless entity concerned mostly with the color of mailboxes and the acceptable height of grass. Then 6 months ago, Karen was elected president. Her husband had recently been downsized from a middle management position, and Karen, a woman who seemed to have a deep, unfulfilled need to manage something, poured all that frustrated energy into the HOA. She drove around in a golf cart she'd christened the Compliance Cruiser, a clipboard her scepter, and a tape measure her sword. From her perspective, my property wasn't a historical holdout. It was a glaring error in her spreadsheet, a defiant tear in the fabric of her beige utopia. She'd started with friendly notes left in my mailbox, invitations to join the HOA, which I politely declined. Then came the unsigned passive-aggressive letters about my overgrown wildflower meadow, a designated pollinator habitat, and the unsightliness of my vintage Ford F-150, which I was lovingly restoring in my detached workshop. Finally, the official-looking notices of violation began, citing bylaws that didn't apply to me for things that weren't my problem. I had ignored them, filing them away in a folder labeled nuisance, assuming she'd eventually tire herself out. But tonight, with her fabricated 911 call about a 50-foot inferno, she had escalated beyond nuisance. She had crossed the line from petty tyrant to a genuine threat. She was using a public safety service as her own personal cudgel, a tactic I found not just contemptible, but dangerous. As the distant wail of a siren grew closer, I felt a familiar calm settle over me, the same focus I'd felt before a mission. Karen's face was a mask of smug triumph. She believed she was about to witness my public humiliation. She was about to be very, very disappointed. The bonfire wasn't just a whim, it was a planned, permitted, and necessary part of managing my land. This was my annual brush clearing, a fire abatement measure that prevented the buildup of dry fuel that could pose a real wildfire threat, a concept apparently lost on the president of an HOA nestled in a tinder-dry California valley. The siren grew louder, a piercing shriek that finally crested the ridge and resolved into the flashing red and blue lights of a single sheriff's department cruiser. It crunched to a halt on the gravel shoulder of the road, its headlights cutting through the dusk and pinning Karen in a perfect theatrical spotlight. She puffed out her chest, ready for her starring role as the concerned citizen. A young deputy stepped out of the car, his face etched with a seriousness that befitted a call about a raging inferno. He was tall, lean, with the ramrod posture of someone who took his duty seriously. He adjusted his belt, his eyes scanning the scene. The modest fire, the calm family, the single irate woman in the pink tracksuit. He walked towards us, his gaze moving from the fire pit to me, and then he stopped. His professional mask dissolved, replaced by a flicker of disbelief, then dawning recognition. "Chief?" he asked, his voice hesitant. "Deputy Miller," I said with a nod, my lips twitching into a smile I couldn't quite suppress. "Good to see you. Didn't realize my little campfire rated a personal visit." Karen's head swiveled between us, her perfectly coiffed helmet of blonde hair immobile. "Chief? What is he talking about? Deputy, this man is a menace. He's violating every fire code in the book." Deputy Miller's eyes, however, never left mine. A slow grin spread across his face. "You know," he said, his voice now relaxed, "for a minute there, I thought I was going to have to give a lecture on fire safety. But something tells me you've probably got it covered." He was one of mine, or he had been. 3 years prior, before he decided the sheriff's department was a better fit, Deputy Alex Miller had been the star recruit in my Firefighter 1 Academy class at the County Training Center. I'd personally overseen his live fire exercises, drilled him on ventilation theory, and signed off on his certification. I knew for a fact that he could, from 100 yards away, tell the difference between a controlled burn and a structure fire. And he certainly knew the difference between a 50-foot inferno and a backyard bonfire. Karen's carefully constructed reality was beginning to fracture. What is going on?" she stammered, her smartphone lowering slightly. "Deputy, do your job. Cite him." Miller finally turned his attention to her, his expression shifting back to one of professional neutrality, but with an undercurrent of profound weariness. "Ma'am," he began, his tone patient, "this is Fire Chief Mark Rivera. He's the head of the entire county fire department. When it comes to fire code, he doesn't just follow the book. He helps write it." The color drained from Karen's face. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The pink tracksuit suddenly seemed less a symbol of authority and more like the pathetic plumage of a flustered flamingo. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a horrifying new understanding. The dragon she thought she was slaying had just turned out to be the keeper of the entire mountain. The triumphant video she'd been recording was now evidence, not of my wrongdoing, but of her own malicious, frivolous 911 call. It was a beautiful moment. Deputy Miller, to his credit, went through the motions. He walked the perimeter of my fire pit with me, his flashlight beam tracing the wide, cleared circle of bare earth I'd established. He noted the charged garden hose connected to the spigot, the second backup hose attached to my workshop's rain barrel pump, and the pair of industrial-grade fire extinguishers standing by like sentinels. "Everything looks textbook, Chief," he said, loud enough for Karen to hear. "Got your burn permit, I assume?" I pulled the folded document from my back pocket and handed it to him. He scanned it briefly. "Yep, Valid from sunset yesterday to sunrise tomorrow. Perfect conditions. Low wind, high humidity. He handed it back, then turned to face Karen, who was now hugging herself as if a cold wind had just blown in. Ma'am, there's no violation here. In fact, what Chief Rivera is doing is a recommended fire prevention measure for a property of this size. It's perfectly legal and perfectly safe. Karen's humiliation was a palpable thing, a thick, sour cloud that settled over her. But humiliation quickly curdled into rage. "This is outrageous," she shrieked, finding her voice again. "This is a classic good old boys club. You're just protecting him because you know him. I'm going to report you to your supervisor. I'll have your badge." Miller didn't even flinch. He just sighed, a deep, long, suffering sound. "You're welcome to do that, ma'am. My supervisor is Sheriff Thompson. He and the chief play poker every other Thursday. I'm sure he'll be very interested to hear about this." He tipped his hat to me. "Sorry to have bothered you, Chief. Sarah. Leo." He gave Karen one last pitying look. "Have a good night, ma'am. Try not to call 911 unless there's an actual emergency." He walked back to his cruiser, the crunch of his boots on the gravel a final, definitive punctuation mark on Karen's defeat. As the taillights disappeared down the road, silence descended once more, broken only by the cheerful crackle of the fire, which seemed to have regained its confidence. Karen stood frozen for a long moment, her face a thunderous mask. Then, without another word, she spun on her heel and marched back toward the manicured lawns of her kingdom. The pink track suit swallowed by the darkness. Sarah let out a long breath she seemed to have been holding since the siren first sounded. "Well," she said, a slow smile spreading across her face, "that was something." Leo was grinning from ear to ear. "Did you see her face, Dad? It was epic." I just stared into the flames, feeding another log into the pit. "This isn't over," I said quietly. "This was a public loss for her. People like that can't stand to lose. She'll be back, and next time, she won't use a phone call. She'll use paperwork." I was right. The very next afternoon, tucked into my mailbox, was a thick, cream-colored envelope bearing the official Oakwood Estates HOA logo. Inside was a letter, typed on heavy bond paper, and signed with a flourish by Karen herself. It was a formal notice of violation, assessing a $500 fine for an unauthorized pyrotechnic display, endangering community safety and property values. It was absurd, unenforceable, and utterly meaningless, as I wasn't bound by her rules. But it was also a gauntlet thrown down. Ignoring it would be seen as weakness. This was no longer a nuisance. This was a campaign. I walked into my office, pulled out a fresh manila folder, and wrote on the tab in black marker, "Operation Nightingale." I wasn't just going to defend my property. I was going to go on the offensive. I was going to dismantle Karen's petty tyranny, not with anger or aggression, but with procedure, documentation, and the slow, grinding power of the very bureaucracy she held so dear. She had weaponized the rules, but she had no idea that I was a grandmaster of that particular game. My first move in Operation Nightingale was to draft a response to her ridiculous fine. I didn't write an angry email or a dismissive note. I composed a formal letter that was a small masterpiece of bureaucratic warfare, designed not just to refute her claim, but to put her on the legal back foot. I sat at my grandfather's old oak desk, the same desk where he'd calculated crop yields and paid his bills, and I laid out my case with the precision of an engineering blueprint. The letter was addressed to the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association Board of Directors, a deliberate choice to include her entire board in the liability. I began by stating, plainly and factually, that the property at 1240 Ridge Road was not and had never been a part of the Oakwood Estates development or subject to its covenants, conditions, and restrictions, CC&Rs. I cited the specific parcel number from the county assessor's office and referenced the date my deed was recorded, a full 15 years before the HOA was incorporated. I included a high-quality copy of the relevant page from my title report, with the legal description of my property highlighted. Next, I addressed the bonfire. I included a certified copy of my burn permit from the county fire department, permit number 72B. I detailed the safety measures I had in place, cross-referencing the exact standards outlined in the County Fire Code, Chapter 4, Section 3, which, and this was the beautiful part, I had co-authored 2 years prior. I attached a sworn affidavit from myself in my official capacity as County Fire Chief, attesting to the safety and legality of the burn. Finally, I turned the tables. I referenced California Civil Code Section 47.5, which pertains to the filing of a false police report, and noted that Deputy Miller's official incident report, which I had already requested a copy of, would corroborate the frivolous nature of her 911 call. I concluded by stating that any further attempts to levy fines, issue violations, or otherwise harass me or my family would be met with immediate legal action seeking damages for harassment and slander of title. I sent the entire package via certified mail, return receipt requested, so I would have a legal record of her receiving it. It was a warning shot, clear and unequivocal. I was demonstrating that I had superior knowledge, superior documentation, and superior standing. I was daring her to proceed. Her response arrived a week later. It was not another fine, but a letter from a law firm, Fincher, Belding, and Croft. It was a formal cease and desist order, but she had pivoted. Realizing the fire was a dead end, she had gone fishing. The letter demanded I immediately cease and desist from maintaining an unauthorized and aesthetically non-compliant outbuilding on my property, my shed. The 200-square-foot workshop my grandfather had built in the 1970s, where I kept my tools and worked on my old truck. It was well-maintained, recently painted a tasteful barn red, and sat a good 300 feet from the nearest HOA property. The letter claimed it violated Article 9, Section 4 of the HOA bylaws regarding accessory structures, which it alleged must be pre-approved by the Architectural Review Committee and finished in one of 3 approved shades of beige. It was a laughable overreach, but it was also a sign of her desperation and her willingness to spend HOA money on lawyers to pursue a personal vendetta. This was the escalation I had predicted. She was using the members' dues to attack a non-member. This was no longer just about me. This was about her abuse of power over the entire community. My investigation broadened. I drove down to the county records office, a dusty basement filled with the scent of old paper and microfilm. I spent an afternoon pulling the original building permit for my shed, dated 1978. It was all in order, signed off, and inspected. Then, I pulled the HOA's incorporation documents and the master plat for the Oakwood Estates subdivision. As I suspected, the map clearly showed my property as an excluded parcel, a blank square around which all the other lots were drawn. My case was ironclad, but I wasn't interested in just defending myself anymore. I wanted to understand the system she was abusing. I submitted a formal request under the Davis-Sterling Act, the California law governing HOAs, for copies of the association's complete bylaws, their meeting minutes for the past 2 years, and their full financial statements, including the current year's budget and reserve study. As a property owner in the county whose property was directly adjacent to the HOA, my lawyer friend assured me I had standing to request documents pertaining to community safety and financial stability, especially now that their lawyer had contacted me. While I waited for those documents, I started taking walks. Not on my own property, but through the winding, identical streets of Oakwood Estates in the early evenings. I wasn't looking for violations, I was looking for people. I was looking for her other victims. It didn't take long to find them. My first encounter was with a man meticulously tending a small patch of lawn, his movements precise and economical. He wore a faded Air Force P t-shirt, and a perfectly aligned American flag flew from a pole next to his porch. I introduced myself as his neighbor from up on the ridge. His name was David, a retired master sergeant who'd spent 20 years keeping fighter jets in the air. "You're the fire chief, right?" he said, shaking my hand. "The one Karen tried to have arrested?" News traveled fast. "That's me," I admitted. A slow, wry smile touched his lips. "Figured. She hates that flagpole," he said, nodding toward the flag. "Says it's 2 feet too tall according to Article 6. Been fining me $50 a week for 6 months. I just sent him back with a note that says, 'See you in court.'" He was a fighter. I liked him immediately. I told him about the shed, and he just shook his head. "That's her M.O. She can't get you on one thing. She'll find another. She's got this whole neighborhood walking on eggshells. He told me about Maria, a single mom down the street who worked 2 jobs. Karen had initiated foreclosure proceedings against her for being behind on her dues she was struggling to pay because of the constant nickel and dime fines for things like her kid's basketball hoop being left in the driveway or a patch of dandelions in her lawn. Then there were the Jacksons, an elderly couple in their 80s who had lived in their house since the development was built. Karen was harassing them to tear out a beloved rose garden because it didn't conform to the approved plant list. The pattern was clear and ugly. Karen wasn't enforcing rules for the betterment of the community. She was wielding them as a weapon of control, targeting the vulnerable, the defiant, and anyone who didn't bow to her authority. The fines weren't about compliance. They were a revenue stream and a tool of intimidation. I invited David over to my place that weekend. "Let's talk off the record," I said. "Her kingdom doesn't extend up the hill." He agreed instantly. I then went and found Maria. I knocked on her door, introduced myself, and gently explained what I was doing. I saw the fear in her eyes. She was terrified of more trouble. But when I told her about David and about my own fight with Karen, a spark of hope ignited. "She sent me a letter from a lawyer," Maria whispered, her voice trembling, "threatening to put a lien on my house. I don't know what to do." "You're not alone anymore," I told her. "Come up to my house on Saturday. We're going to figure it out." I visited the Jacksons next. Mr. Jackson, a frail man with a fierce pride, initially wanted to handle it himself, but Mrs. Jackson, seeing the stress it was causing him, tearfully accepted my invitation. That Saturday, the 4 of them, David the veteran, Maria the single mom, and the gentle, worried Jacksons, sat in my living room, a space free from the prying eyes of the compliance cruiser. I had a fire going in the hearth, a legal and cozy one this time. I laid out all my documents on the coffee table. Karen's letters, my certified mail receipts, the county maps, the building permits. They in turn brought their own files. David had a thick binder with every fine, every letter, every canceled check for the ones he'd paid under protest. Maria had a shoebox full of threatening notices. The Jacksons had a heartbreaking collection of photos of their award-winning roses, juxtaposed with Karen's cruel, impersonal demands. As we pieced it all together, the picture became undeniable. This was a systematic pattern of abuse. My Operation Nightingale file was no longer just about me. It was now a chronicle of a community under siege. We formed an alliance right then and there, a small, quiet resistance movement. Our goal was no longer just to fend her off. Our goal was to remove her. David, with his military discipline, would organize the residents. Maria, who knew everyone's story, would be our network. The Jacksons represented the heart of the community she was trying to crush. And I, with my knowledge of systems and my growing file of evidence, would be the architect of her downfall. The paperwork I had requested from the HOA was due to arrive any day. I had a feeling that within those financial statements, we would find the real rot. The box arrived via courier a few days later. It was heavier than I expected, filled with binders and stacks of paper held together by rubber bands. The official financial records of the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association. I cleared my large dining room table, the one we use for holiday dinners, and transformed it into a war room. The scent of toner and cheap paper filled the air as I began to lay everything out. Budgets, income statements, balance sheets, bank reconciliations, and 2 years' worth of detailed transaction registers. My wife, Sarah, who had spent a decade as a forensic accountant before we had Leo, walked in with 2 mugs of coffee. She took one look at the sea of paper, and her eyes lit up with a professional gleam I hadn't seen in years. "Looks like someone's books need a good audit," she said, pulling up a chair. "What are we looking for?" "Anything," I said. "Anything that doesn't feel right. She's arrogant. Arrogant people get sloppy." We worked for hours, a silent, focused team. I'd read out line items and she'd trace them back through the bank statements. At first, it all seemed frustratingly mundane. Dues collections, water bills, insurance premiums. But then Sarah tapped a page with her pen. "Here," she said, "look at this. KB Landscape and Design. They get a flat $5,000 a month, every month." "For what exactly?" I flipped through the budget. "Grounds maintenance, common areas," I read. "Seems high for the amount of green space they have. It's mostly just a few strips of grass by the entrance and around the community pool. It's not just high, it's lazy, Sarah said. No itemized invoice, no hourly breakdown, just a flat 5 grand, month in, month out. Who owns KB Landscape and Design? A quick search on my laptop of the state's business registry gave us the answer. The registered agents for KB Landscape and Design were Karen and Robert Blevins. Robert was her husband's name. She was paying her own husband $60,000 a year in HOA funds. It might not be illegal if it was disclosed and won through a competitive bid, but it stank of self-dealing. Keep digging, I said, a cold knot of anger tightening in my stomach. An hour later, I found another thread. A quarterly payment of $2,500 labeled administrative consulting was being paid to a firm called Oakwood Strategic Solutions, LLC. The address was just a P.O. box in a neighboring town. That's 10 grand a year for consulting, Sarah mused. Consulting on what? How to write threatening letters. Another business search revealed the registered agent for Oakwood Strategic Solutions, one Gerald Finney. The name was unfamiliar, so I did a quick social media search. Karen's public Facebook profile was a shrine to her HOA activities, filled with pictures of freshly painted curbs and compliant trash cans. I scrolled back through her family photos. There, at a family barbecue, was a picture of Karen, her husband Robert, and another man all grinning over a plate of burnt hot dogs. The caption read, "So great to have my brother-in-law Gary in town for the 4th. Gary, Gerald Finney. A quick cross-reference confirmed it. She was paying her brother-in-law $10,000 a year for a no-show consulting gig. The audacity was breathtaking. This wasn't just a power trip anymore. This was a family enterprise funded by the mandatory dues of her neighbors. She was bleeding the community dry to enrich her own family, all while threatening to foreclose on a single mother for being a few $100s behind. The anger I felt was cold and sharp. This was a betrayal of trust on a scale that beggared belief. The fines, the harassment, the obsession with control, it was all a smokescreen. The real game was embezzlement. We spent the rest of the night documenting everything, creating a separate file for the financial evidence. We copied the invoices, the bank statements showing the cash checks, the business registry printouts. We built a clear, undeniable chain of evidence showing a direct flow of money from the HOA's bank account into the pockets of her immediate family. This changed the entire scope of Operation Nightingale. My fight over a shed was now a small part of a much larger criminal conspiracy. We had to be careful. A direct accusation without overwhelming proof would be dismissed as a personal grudge. We needed more than just the paperwork. We needed an event. We needed a public forum where she would be forced to answer for her actions. We needed to set a trap so perfect that she would walk right into it, convinced of her own invincibility. And as I scanned the meeting minutes, I found it. The annual Community Improvement Project. This year, Karen had proudly announced the initiative, repaving the 1,500 square foot asphalt walkway that wound around the community pool. The project had been approved by the board, which consisted of her and 2 of her hand-picked cronies, and the contract had been awarded. I didn't even need to look. I knew exactly who had won the bid. KB Landscape and Design, for the staggering sum of $28,000. This was our moment. This was the ambush. The plan was simple, elegant, and ruthless. It would use Karen's own beloved bylaws as the jaws of the trap. The first step was to establish a baseline of truth. David, with his no-nonsense military bearing, was perfect for the task. He spent a day calling 3 of the most reputable, bonded, and insured paving contractors in the county. He didn't tell them it was for an HOA. He just gave them the specs. 1,500 square feet of asphalt walkway, removal of the old surface, and proper grading. The quotes came back within 48 hours. The first was for $11,500. The second was for $12,200. The third, from the biggest company in the valley, was for $13,500. The average was less than half of the $28,000 contract Karen had awarded to her husband's company. The overcharge wasn't just a little padding. It was a blatant, shameless cash grab of at least $15,000 of the community's money. The second step was the legal ammunition. I spent an evening with my copy of the Oakwood Estates CC&RS, highlighting every relevant passage. The key was Article 11, Section 2. Any single expenditure for capital improvements exceeding $10,000 must be approved by a majority vote of the Board of Directors and must be presented for community review at a regularly scheduled quarterly meeting prior to the commencement of work. Karen and her two board sycophants had voted to approve it, but they had buried the approval in the minutes of a special session that no one attended and had never formally presented it for community review. They planned to just do the work and put the expense in the next newsletter, long after the money was spent. This was her critical error. She had followed the first part of the rule, but ignored the second, assuming no one would ever read that far into the fine print. The third and final step was mobilization. We had 3 weeks until the next scheduled quarterly HOA meeting. Maria, using her extensive social network, began to quietly spread the word. She didn't share the explosive details, just a simple, urgent message. You need to be at this meeting. Big things are being discussed about our money. Please come. David and I worked on the presentation. We created a simple one-page handout. At the top, in bold letters, it read, "Is our HOA money being spent wisely? Let's look at the pool walkway project." Below, we listed the facts in stark, undeniable columns. On the left, contract awarded to KB Landscape and Design. Owner, Robert Blevins, husband of HOA, President Karen Blevins, $28,000. On the right, independent professional quotes for the same job, followed by the names of the 3 reputable companies and their quotes. At the bottom, we printed Article 11, Section 2 in its entirety with the community review clause highlighted in yellow. We made 100 copies. The night before the meeting, our little alliance gathered one last time in my workshop. The air was thick with anticipation. "Are we ready for this?" Maria asked, her voice a nervous whisper. "She's going to be furious." "Let her be," David said, his jaw set. "She's been ruling by fear for a year. It's time someone showed up with facts." I looked at the faces of my new friends, the determined veteran, the brave mother, the gentle gardeners who had found their resolve. We were a strange, unlikely army, but we were united. "She won't see it coming," I said. "Her arrogance is her blind spot. She thinks she's untouchable. Tomorrow we're going to hold up a mirror, and the whole neighborhood is going to see what she really is." I felt no malice, only a grim sense of purpose. This wasn't about revenge for a bonfire or a shed. This was about restoring order. It was about accountability. Karen had built her little empire on a foundation of paper, and we were about to show her that paper can burn. The trap was set. The bait, her own pride, was irresistible. All we had to do now was wait for her to step into the light. The community center meeting room was usually a sad, beige space, populated by a handful of retirees and Karen's 2 board cronies. The treasurer, a mousy woman named Brenda, and the secretary, a perpetually confused man named Stan. Tonight, it was different. The room was packed. Every single one of the 50 chairs was filled, and people were standing along the back and side walls. Maria had done her job. David and I stood near the back, and as people filed in, we discreetly handed them our one-page summary. A low murmur filled the room as people read the sheet, their expressions shifting from curiosity to shock, then to a slow, simmering anger. I saw neighbors who had been fined for trivial offenses, whispering to each other, pointing at the numbers on the page. The Jacksons were there, sitting in the front row, looking frail but resolute. Up at the front table, Karen Blevins was beaming, completely oblivious. She saw the packed room not as a sign of rebellion, but as a testament to her own importance. She probably imagined they had all come to admire her leadership. She wore a royal blue blazer with a large, gaudy HOA president name badge pinned to the lapel. She tapped the microphone. "Welcome, everyone. It's so wonderful to see such a fantastic turnout for our quarterly meeting," she chirped. She launched into her usual litany of announcements. Reminders about trash can placement, a stern warning about overnight parking, a celebration of the Most Compliant Lawn of the Month award. The crowd was restless, the papers in their hands rustling like dry leaves. Karen, high on her own authority, didn't notice. Then she arrived at the main event. "And now," she said, her voice swelling with pride, "for some very exciting news. As part of our ongoing commitment to improving our beautiful community, the board has approved a much-needed capital improvement project. We will be completely repaving the pool walkway. A smattering of confused, half-hearted applause died almost instantly. The work will be done by our trusted partner, KB Landscape and Design, and will begin next month. This was it. This was the moment. I took a deep breath and took a step forward into the center aisle. "Point of order, Madam President," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but it was clear and carried the ingrained authority of command. It cut through the room's low hum, and every head turned towards me. Karen squinted, her smile tightening. "Excuse me. This is a meeting for members of the association." "I'm aware," I said calmly. "However, your association's legal counsel has seen fit to contact me regarding my property, which makes your association's business my business. Furthermore, I believe a member in good standing wishes to yield his time to me." On cue, David stood up from his seat in the third row. "I do," he said, his voice ringing with conviction. "I'm David Jensen, 412 Oak Circle. I'm a member in good standing, and I yield my time to my neighbor, Mark Rivera. I believe he has some questions about this project that the entire community deserves to hear answered." Karen was cornered. Denying a member in good standing the right to speak, especially in front of this many witnesses, would be a gross procedural violation. Her face flushed a deep, blotchy red. "Fine," she spat. "You have 2 minutes." "I'll only need 1, I replied, walking slowly to the front of the room. I didn't stand at the podium. I stood on the floor, on the same level as the homeowners. I held up the single sheet of paper. "I have a question regarding the pool walkway project," I began, my voice even and measured. "I see the contract was awarded for $28,000. My question is for the board. Was this contract put out for a competitive bid?" Karen's eyes darted to Brenda and Stan, who both suddenly found the ceiling fascinating. "KB Landscape has been our partner for a year," Karen said dismissively. "We have an excellent working relationship with them. So the answer is no, there was no competitive bidding process," I stated, letting the fact hang in the air. "Interesting, because I have here 3 independent quotes from licensed, bonded contractors. Their prices for the exact same job are $11,500, $12,200, and $13,500. The room erupted in gasps and angry murmurs. I held up a hand for silence. "That is less than half the price that the board has agreed to pay KB Landscape, a company which, according to state records, is co-owned by our HOA president's husband, Robert Blevins." The murmurs turned into outright shouts. "Scam!" someone yelled from the back. "That's our money!" another shouted. Karen was on her feet, banging a tiny gavel on the table. "Order! Order! This is a slanderous accusation." "It's not an accusation, Karen," I said, using her first name for the first time. The lack of title was a deliberate blow. "It's a fact. And here's another fact." I raised my voice slightly to be heard over the din. "Article 11, Section 2 of your own bylaws requires any expenditure over $10,000 to be presented for community review at a quarterly meeting. This meeting, you never did that. You tried to bury it." I turned from her and addressed the crowd directly. She was going to give her husband a $15,000 bonus, paid for by you, and she was breaking your own rules to do it. It was like a dam breaking. All the pent-up frustration from months of petty fines and bullying tactics burst forth. People were on their feet, shouting at the board table. Maria stood up. "What about the foreclosure notice you sent me, Karen? Was that so you could pay your brother-in-law's consulting firm?" An elderly man stood up. "What about the lien you put on my house for $100 in fines for my wife's garden gnomes?" Karen's face had gone from red to a pasty, sickly white. She looked at the faces in the crowd and saw not adoration, but 100 tiny mutinies. Her power, which had always been an illusion built on bluff and intimidation, was dissolving in real time. She grabbed her gavel and hammered it frantically. "This meeting is adjourned," she shrieked. But no one was listening to her anymore. The authority was gone. David stepped forward, his voice cutting through the chaos like a bugle call. "This meeting is not adjourned. I am making a motion under Article 4 for an immediate vote of no confidence in the current board and for the election of an interim board to secure the association's financial records." The trap had not just been sprung, it had snapped shut with brutal, beautiful finality. Karen Blevins, president, tyrant, and embezzler, was finished. The chaos of the meeting coalesced into swift, decisive action. David's motion for a vote of no confidence was immediately seconded by about 30 people at once. According to the bylaws, the very documents Karen had used as her Bible and her bludgeon, such a motion made and seconded at a quorum meeting had to be put to an immediate vote. Karen, sputtering and pale, tried to argue, but the will of the room was an unstoppable tide. Hands shot up across the room, a forest of righteous indignation. The vote was nearly unanimous. Karen, Brenda, and Stan were stripped of their titles and their power in a public spectacle of their own making. It was a stunningly swift coup, executed not with weapons, but with Robert's Rules of Order and a one-page handout. David, by popular acclaim, was nominated and elected as the interim president. Maria and a quiet, respected accountant named Mr. Henderson were elected to the other two board seats. Their very first act as the new board, taken right there at the front table while Karen watched in horror, was to pass a motion. The interim board of the Oakwood Estates HOA, David announced, his voice steady and strong, hereby votes to turn over all financial records, meeting minutes, and correspondence from the previous board to the county district attorney's office for a full investigation into possible embezzlement, fraud, and self-dealing. He then turned and looked directly at me, still standing at the back of the room. And we would like to formally thank our neighbor, Mr. Mark Rivera, for bringing these matters to our attention. The investigation will begin with the comprehensive file he has already prepared. Karen let out a small, strangled gasp. Her eyes, wide and filled with a venomous hatred, locked onto mine. This was all my fault. In her mind, her criminal behavior wasn't the problem. My exposing it was. The meeting broke up, but the people didn't just leave. They lingered, talking in excited, liberated groups. They clapped David on the back. They hugged Maria. Several people, strangers to me, came up to shake my hand, their eyes filled with gratitude. The Jacksons came over, and Mrs. Jackson, with tears in her eyes, simply said, "Thank you for our roses." The following week was a blur of activity. The new board, armed with the authority of their positions, formally collected every document from Karen's house. She was forced to hand over the HOA laptop, the binders of invoices, the checkbooks. They changed the locks on the community center office and changed the passwords on all the accounts. David and Mr. Henderson then personally delivered my Operation Nightingale file, now supplemented with even more evidence they had uncovered, to the DA's office. The wheels of justice, which can often grind so slowly, began to turn with surprising speed. The amount of money involved, coupled with the sheer number of affected residents, made it a priority case. An assistant district attorney was assigned, and the sheriff's department was tasked with the investigation. One afternoon, about 2 weeks after the meeting, I was in my front yard, kneeling in the soft earth of my vegetable garden, thinning out carrots. It was peaceful, the only sounds the buzzing of bees and the distant cry of a hawk circling overhead. Then I heard the familiar sound of official vehicles. Not one, but three. 2 sheriff's cruisers and a black, unmarked sedan drove slowly past my property. They didn't stop at my place. They continued another 100 yards and pulled up directly in front of Karen Blevins's perfectly manicured, most compliant lawn. Doors opened. Deputies emerged along with 2 plainclothes detectives. One of them was holding a document, a search warrant. I saw Deputy Miller get out of his cruiser. He caught my eye from across the distance, and for just a second, he gave a slow, deliberate nod. It wasn't a gesture of collusion. It was one of respect. It was an acknowledgement that the system, which his former chief had trusted, was now working. And then came the symbolic, perfect, final confrontation. As the deputies knocked on her door, Karen burst out, her face a mask of fury. She wasn't holding a phone this time. She was just a raw, exposed nerve of rage. She saw the officers, she saw the warrant, and then she saw me, standing calmly by my garden, holding a bunch of freshly picked carrots. Her mind, unable to process her own culpability, found the only target it could. "You!" she screamed, her voice cracking. She pointed a trembling finger at me, her body shaking. "You did this! You ruined my life!" She stormed across her perfect lawn, right to the edge of her property line, the same invisible line where she had stood on the night of the bonfire. But the power dynamic was now completely reversed. Then she was the accuser, the one wielding authority. Now she was the accused, her authority gone, her kingdom crumbling behind her as officers began carrying boxes of evidence out of her house. She just stood there screaming obscenities at me, telling me I was a monster, that I had destroyed her family. I didn't say a word. I just stood there, holding my carrots, and watched. The woman who had tried to use the law as her personal weapon was now being consumed by it. The fire she had started had finally reached her own house. The legal process was methodical and crushing. Faced with the mountain of evidence in my file, the invoices, the bank records, the business registrations, the independent quotes, Karen and her husband Robert knew a trial would be a slaughter. Their lawyer advised them to take a deal. They pleaded guilty to felony charges of wire fraud and conspiracy to commit fraud. The judge was not amused. He was an old-school jurist who despised seeing community organizations turned into personal piggy banks. The sentence was harsh. There was no jail time, a concession the DA made in exchange for the plea, but the financial penalties were devastating. They were ordered to pay full restitution to the Oakwood Estates HOA for every single dollar they had funneled to themselves and their family members. The total came to just over $142,000. But the judge added a final, crushing blow. He invoked a rarely used provision allowing for the seizure and sale of assets to satisfy the restitution order. Karen's obsession with property values had come full circle. To pay back the community she had stolen from, the court ordered the sale of her house at 410 Oak Circle. The irony was so thick you could pave a walkway with it. The woman who had weaponized property rules to control her neighbors lost her own property as a consequence of her crimes. The for sale sign that went up on her lawn was a monument to her downfall. The final indignity was that the new HOA board, under David's leadership, passed a special assessment, not to cover the stolen funds, which would be returned, but to create a legal defense fund to protect the HOA from future abuses of power. The community, empowered and united, was now vaccinating itself against another infection like Karen. Under David's steady hand, the HOA was transformed. The first thing he did was lead a complete rewrite of the C&RS. They were simplified, stripped of the petty, vindictive clauses. Transparency was mandated. All contracts over $1,000 required 3 competitive bids. All financial statements were to be posted online for all residents to see. The Architectural Review Committee was disbanded and replaced with a Community Harmony Committee whose goal was to mediate, not punish. David's flagpole was no longer a violation, it was an inspiration. Maria's kids' basketball hoop was just a sign of a happy, active family. The Jacksons' Rose Garden was declared a community treasure, and the HOA even chipped in for some new mulch. The atmosphere in Oakwood Estates changed. The fear was gone, replaced by a sense of shared ownership and relief. People started talking to each other again. Block parties were planned. The invisible walls of suspicion that Karen had built came tumbling down. Months later, I received a formal invitation in the mail. It was for the Oakwood Estates Community Restoration Barbecue. It was being held on the common area lawn, right next to the pool. I walked down the hill that Saturday evening. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the valley. The air was filled with the smell of grilled hamburgers and the sound of children's laughter. The infamous walkway had been repaved. The job had been done by one of the companies David had gotten a quote from, and it had come in under budget at $12,000. It looked fantastic. I was greeted at the entrance by David, who shook my hand firmly. "Glad you could make it, Mark," he said, a wide grin on his face. "You're our guest of honor." He led me through the crowd, and for a moment I felt like an outsider again. But then people started coming up to me, smiling, thanking me, offering me a beer or a plate of food. I wasn't the enemy on the hill anymore. I was just Mark, their neighbor. At dusk, David stood on a picnic bench and tapped a glass for attention. He gave a short, heartfelt speech about new beginnings and the power of community. "We all learned a valuable lesson this year," he said. "We learned that rules are meant to serve the community, not the other way around. And we learned that when one person has the courage to stand up to injustice, they're never really standing alone for long." He then looked over at me, and we owe a huge debt of gratitude to the man who had that courage. "Mark, come on up here." I was pushed forward by the crowd. David handed me a small, heavy object wrapped in tissue paper. It was a gag gift, a miniature gold-painted fire extinguisher mounted on a wooden plaque. The inscription read, "To Mark Rivera, Chief of Putting Out Fires. With gratitude, Oakwood Estates." The crowd roared with laughter and applause. I held up the trophy, a smile finally breaking across my face. I looked out at all of them, David, Maria, the Jacksons, and all the other families. And I saw a community that had been tested and had emerged stronger, kinder, and more united. My property line was still my property line, a clear and definite boundary. But the invisible wall that had separated me from my neighbors, the wall of suspicion and mistrust that Karen had built, was gone forever. The fire she tried to use to burn me had, in the end, been the very thing that forged a new and better neighborhood from the ashes of her petty tyranny.